Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And I am very happy because today I am speaking to Tim Wyatt. Hello, Tim.
Hello there.
Your talk for the Astrological Lodge of London caught my eye because it was about elementals. And in astrology, understanding the elements is such an important part of understanding the symbolism behind the 12 signs that I thought it would be interesting to discover more about elementals. So it might be good to get an understanding of what we mean by elementals.
Okay, well, I'm speaking mainly from a theosophical perspective, and we have a particular understanding of this. Just to put it into some sort of context, which I hope people can understand, we talk about the different kingdoms of nature. Obviously, we're familiar with the human kingdom, the animal kingdom, the plant and vegetable kingdom, and the mineral kingdom. But we also speak of three invisible kingdoms of nature which are below the mineral, and we call these the three elemental kingdoms, which are basically non-physical dimensions. And we have to understand that the elementals, or indeed, as we might call them, the nature spirits, correspond to these, but they also correspond to the four elements of air, earth, fire, and water. So we'll get the gnomes of the earth, salamanders of fire, the sylphs of the air, and the undines of the water. And this is one way of classifying these particular kingdoms. But the important thing to remember is that they are non-physical. They are entirely non-physical kingdoms of nature. And therefore they operate on more refined levels of reality, such as the astral plane. The astral plane in Theosophy and the Ageless Wisdom teachings is a dimension which is above the physical kingdom, and it kind of mirrors the physical plane of existence with which we're all familiar. So you might regard the astral plane as a template, a blueprint, if you like, for everything that exists on the physical plane. Because the elementals, or the nature spirits, and I'll use these terms interchangeably, because they are non-physical, this is why they're very difficult, particularly in the modern world, for people to perceive. And it's only really people who have a certain degree of elevated consciousness, or indeed astral vision or clairvoyance, who are able to perceive these at all.
Just listening to what you're saying there's a number of questions. The way that you spoke implied almost a hierarchy, so that because you said that the elemental kingdom is below the mineral kingdom. Can you elaborate more on this? Is there a hierarchy, or is this just a figure of speech?
No, there are very much hierarchies, and not just hierarchies, but hierarchies within hierarchies. I mean, the four types of, broadly the four types of elementals or nature spirits, all have very, very different functions. But what people really need to understand, and what most people don't understand, because they are largely invisible to our physical senses, is that these entities are absolutely vital in preserving life as we know it on Earth. They operate on all the levels of nature. They operate in all the kingdoms of nature: mineral, plant, vegetable, animal, human. And therefore they are the preservers. They help to create physical structures. They are important in playing a role in the gestation of human beings, or in the growth of plants, or the preservation of animal bodies, and even in the evolution of the mineral kingdom, because the mineral kingdom is evolving very, very slowly compared to human beings or animals or plants. But nevertheless, it is evolving over vast periods of time. So to understand these things, you have to understand that there are these non-physical dimensions. And this is very difficult for a lot of people, because we live very much in a materialistic universe where seeing is believing. If we can't perceive something with our physical senses, if we can't touch, taste, see it, hear it, etc., we tend not to believe it. But for example, our vision is extremely limited. Human vision is not as good as the vision of certain animals. Birds like vultures, for example, or high-flying birds have a much better visual system than we as human beings do. And human beings can only see less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum. And, the rest of the 99% of it is not easily perceived, certainly through our normal vision. It's only when people use their higher senses, the astral senses, that they are able to come across these things and see them at all. And the number of people who are able to do this is extremely limited. However, nature spirits and elementals feature in every single culture throughout human history. And before the industrial age, which started in the late 18th century, when most people lived in the countryside and there was no electric lighting and all these things, people were much closer to nature, and folklore, myth, legend abounds with tales of these particular entities. And obviously they are very much local to particular areas. For example, in Scandinavia, you would get the trolls, the ones who are basically mineral type entities. In the Hindu pantheon, there are 330 million different types of elementals and nature spirits, but every culture speaks of them. In England, for example, if you go back and read accounts of people coming across these things, country folk back in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were very much an everyday feature of people's lives, because our perception then was rather different. It wasn't colored by the deeply materialistic viewpoint and emphasis that we have these days. And so people were much more intimately connected. And they understood that nature spirits and elementals played an important part in the weather. They played an important part in the growth of crops and the health and well-being of their livestock. And they knew this, and they communed with these various entities. And every culture, from the Babylonian to Australian Aborigines to China, the Native Americans, and indeed every other, had their own version of these, but they tended to be perceived in terms of that culture. Now, one of the interesting things is, if you read accounts of country folk coming across these things, perhaps in the late 18th century, there are many, many stories of the elementals being quite mischievous spirits, and they often were said to be somewhat hostile to human beings because of our coarse physical vibrations. But nevertheless, people did come across them. And often when they saw them at this time, 200 years ago, these elementals were actually dressed, or appeared to be, from an even earlier era. So if we go back to, say, the late 18th century, people would have perceived them as they would have been perhaps 200 years before that, in the clothing and the garb of Elizabethan periods. And this is a very intriguing idea. But every part of the UK has stories of people walking along dark country roads late at night and being confronted by these things. They're often lured into fairy palaces where they appear to spend one night, and then they come out and it's 100 years has elapsed. And this is where you get stories like Rip Van Winkle and so on.
So why is it, do you think, that so many stories, which of course we now call fairy tales, in these encounters between human and elemental, the human is always in some way at a disadvantage or harmed? Good things tend not to happen so much when these encounters happen.
Well, often these encounters did involve a certain degree of jeopardy, yes. Although there are accounts also of these nature spirits and elementals being helpful to people as well. So you get both things. Often the nature spirits and elementals are described as having the temperament of naughty children, being mischievous, playing tricks and joking with people, but often doing things which were to humans' disadvantage. For example, when Christianity started to embed itself in Britain during Saxon times and after that, and when the early Christians built churches on sacred sites of the old religion, there are many, many stories of the stones being moved during the night by these elementals. There are also stories of people trying to build roads through fairy circles. You know, the fairy circle of is a place where they would gather. And if that space were infringed or interfered with in some way, then the fairy folk would take great exception to that and would do sometimes very harmful things. They would damage the crops or ensure that the cattle didn't survive and all sorts of other things. So they were very protective of their own areas, of their special places and so on.
It's making me think about accounts of mining operations, particularly in the far north, where people have had, in fact, I'm thinking of one in particular, I can't remember where it was, but it ended up that the whole camp the whole setup had to be shut down because there was such a violent reaction from some sort of entity that people actually were not safe. And everybody was talking about it being poltergeist activity. But I'm now wondering, could this be an elemental experience? So maybe the real question that's coming into my mind is, are we still experiencing this type of thing, but perhaps misnaming it or going with a different interpretation to that of our forebears?
Well, interestingly, when you read stories and accounts of miners in a number of countries, particularly in Scandinavia and particularly in the UK, and especially in the 19th and early 20th century, there are many stories of miners coming across entities deep underground. And there are claims that these entities may have caused rock falls and may have actually damaged the mining operations because they resented the presence of humans damaging their environment. And these stories are not uncommon at all. As far as poltergeists are concerned, I think we're probably talking about a separate phenomenon there. There may be instances where people perceive these things as poltergeists because they would tend to ascribe poltergeist activities to anything invisible that was somehow interfering with their present environment. But I don't think the things are necessarily the same things, and it might be the case that people are conflating one experience with another.
That was what I was wondering. So I'm thinking now about the astrological context, and the fact that each sign is of a particular element, and how that means that each element has certain attributes, and that many of us as astrologers want to understand these attributes to be able to work with them in terms of being able to work with transits that we're experiencing, or perhaps better understanding ourselves and what we need. So in that spirit of, call it co-creation, collaboration, is there something that we can do personally to cultivate a positive relationship with elementals?
I think there is, but the real difficulty here is that if you go onto the streets of Britain at the moment and start talking about fairies at the bottom of your garden, people are going to immediately think you've gone insane and recommend that you go into a psychiatric hospital. So one of the problems we have these days is because the modern mind is so skeptical, and because it is so cynical about these accounts of elementals and nature spirits, and it puts all these legends and myths and fairy tales down to, oh, primitive superstition, our stupid ancestors who were ignorant peasants and didn't know any better. The difficulty is, if you don't believe in these things in the first place, it's very difficult to make any kind of contact with them. But I think that people intuitively, particularly people who are perhaps a little bit more switched on, people who are a little bit more sensitive than the average person in the modern world, are able to perceive these things. When you think about it, many people are drawn to certain types of locations. Particularly in the modern world, people are drawn to nature. They like to go to woods and waterfalls and hilltops and other places where nature is still relatively raw. And certainly I'm not a clairvoyant, but I am quite a sensitive person. And sometimes when you're walking through a wood, you can perceive these things. You can actually hear sounds, or you feel something brushing against your face. When I sit in my garden in Yorkshire, I'm often very much aware that there are other presences about. I have a cat who is extremely sensitive to these things. Sometimes when we're sitting in the garden, or indeed in the house itself, you see the cat staring up into the corner of the room, and she can see things that I can't see, because animals are closer to this kind of astral vision than human beings tend to be. But children, before they get conditioned into this materialistic mindset that we have, they have some kind of perception of these things. And this is where we get ideas like invisible friends. You see children talking to these entities, but you need to just open your mind to these things. And it may be that just the smell of a flower is actually evidence of an elemental presence. It may be that as you're walking along and you hear a babbling brook or a waterfall, or the wind blowing on the top of a hill, that may be an indication of the presence of these elemental entities.
So for those who are of a more open disposition and who would like to create a better connection or nurture a better connection with nature spirits, what could they do?
Well, first of all, they have to be open to the idea that these things exist. You know, if you absolutely deny that these things are in any way part of our world, then, you know, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that. As well as operating on the astral level, they also operate on the upper reaches of the physical level as well. Now, by that, I don't mean in terms of solids, liquids, and gases. Certainly in the theosophical tradition, we talk about the etheric states of reality, and these are four states which are above solids, liquids, and gases in various finer and more rarefied states. And some of these elementals may step down from the non-physical astral level onto the etheric level. Some people do perceive very basic etheric vision. If you go out on a very bright sunny day and you stand with your back to the sun and maybe look up into the sky, sometimes you can see what looks almost like smoke, cigarette smoke or something like wisps of things. And sometimes if you defocus your eyes and don't try and focus too much on a particular thing, you can start to pick these things up, and you do start to get a sense of their presence. But the easiest way for people to do this is not through any of their physical senses, but through something which human beings are gradually beginning to develop, which is intuition. We call it the wisdom intuition principle. And over time, many generations in the future, human beings will have a much more highly developed sense of intuition than they do at the moment. This is another principle which will become part of it'll become our sixth sense eventually. Some people have it, and a lot of children now, a lot of people coming into incarnation right now seem to have this principle much more acutely developed than their parents or grandparents did. The problem here is that people tend to mistrust their intuition. You know, we all talk about our gut feeling. Sometimes we get a gut feeling about something. And people in certain professions, in the medical profession, police officers, even journalists, as I was for many years, sometimes know that something is there. They perceive something without having any physical evidence for it. They just get this overwhelming feeling that something is true. And the wisdom intuition principle is something that is above the intellectual mind. We rely so much now on our intellectual faculties, and they in themselves can be quite a blinding influence, because the mind, as useful as it is, as we all know, can also be very much a limiting factor, and it can filter out certain things, whereas wisdom intuition bypasses the mind and comes in at a much more sophisticated level. So we are getting perceptions, we're receiving information, we are learning things and finding out things. And we don't quite know why, because we can't necessarily weigh that up against our intellectual faculties. And if we don't do that, we tend to mistrust it. So people all the time have these things coming through to them, but they block them off, they filter them out, because it doesn't really fit in with the modern logical, materialistic mindset in which we're all so deeply embedded. So to some extent, you have to kind of suspend your own judgment and just go deeper into yourself to understand these things. It's a question of, I think, opening up new channels of information. And some people do this in various ways. I mean, one of the most tried and tested ways of doing this is through various meditation techniques or relaxation techniques, where you try and still the mind and you try and open the mind to greater things. Well, not open up the mind, open up your perception to greater things. But not many people can do this because we are so dominated by our minds. We talk about, in theosophy in particular, we talk about the monkey mind. It's very difficult to still it. And all the time we're getting this chatter, you know, one thought bouncing off another thought. And we're not really in control of our minds. It's almost as if our minds are in control of us. And so it requires a different way of perception. It requires a different mindset to understand that there are other channels of information besides our physical senses, besides our intellectual faculties. We often talk about, you know, the left side of the brain, the logical, rational side of the brain, and we talk about the right side of the brain, which is much more intuitive, which is much more to do with irrational things. And very few people have that balance between the two. It's easier for people in other cultures, particularly in the East, to meditate. It's very hard for people in the West to meditate because it goes against everything that we've been taught to believe. I know that meditation is something that's very big these days, and it's being taught to children with you know, remarkable results. And meditation is also well proven to be a good healing technique. So it's a question really of suspending your prejudices and opening yourselves up to other realities. And of course, the fact that most people live in cities these days, which are just full of all sorts of coarse vibrations, it's very difficult. You know, if you're walking down Oxford Street in London, it's very difficult to perceive anything other than the full-on reality of the traffic and the people and the shops and all the rest of it. Whereas if you're in a much more natural environment, if you're in the countryside, in a quiet wood or on a hilltop or somewhere like that, you tend to be much more connected to nature. And it's because we've become divorced from nature, and therefore to some extent divorced from ourselves. It's because we've become divorced from nature that we find it so difficult to see anything but the immediate physical reality. And this is quite hard to communicate to people because people tend to laugh at it. We put so much weight now on logic, on supposed rationality, that we actually cut off large parts of our own perception by doing that.
So let's say I have a garden and I've decided, because I'm an astrologer, that I'm going to bring into my gardening practice the phases of the moon. So I'm now going to be working in a biodynamic way with the phases of the moon, and I want to improve the soil using biodynamic principles. And at the same time, I want in some way to connect with the earth. Clearly, that's part of gardening. We have to connect with the earth because we have to nourish the soil in order for the plants to thrive, etc. But now I'm also aware that there is a nature spirit that is intimately connected with this element of earth. How can I perhaps find a way to work collaboratively with this nature spirit, even though I might not be able to see it? What can I do that will be helpful in creating a positive relationship?
Well, again, it's about not necessarily looking outwards, but looking inwards. You know, we always tend to think that everything that we need to know is somehow out there. But in all the wisdom traditions of the world, they all teach you to look inward because that's where the answers are. You know, we can stare into the furthest depths of space with our telescopes and everything, but we can also stare very deeply into our own inner worlds. So it's a question of defocusing our physical senses and just opening ourselves up to the possibility. Maybe, close your eyes in the garden and try and just sense these things in other ways. It may come to you through, as I say, sounds or smells or scents from flowers or other impressions as well. I'm able to do this to some degree, but you're right about the phases of the moon as well. I mean, this idea of biodynamic farming was an idea that was, well, farmers had known about it for thousands of years, but in the modern era, a man called Rudolf Steiner, who started the anthroposophical movement about 100 years ago now, he was very much into this. But farmers know that if you plant stuff when the moon is waxing, you're liable to get better crops and better plants than if you do it when the moon is waning, because the energies are different. And there is a connection between these energies. I can't tell you precisely what it is, but there is a relation between these energies and these various classes of nature spirits. You mentioned earlier on about there being hierarchies, and there are hierarchies of these nature spirits, because the gnomes of the earth are said to be much less developed than, for example, the salamanders of fire or the sylphs of the air. Another important thing to remember here is that the nature spirits and the elementals don't work in isolation. They are often regarded as the builders, the workers, but they are directed by higher authority through another kingdom of nature above the human kingdom, which we call the kingdom of the devas, or the kingdom of angels. The Devic stream of evolution is a separate one from the human kingdom, and there are connections between the two. But human beings, when they no longer need to incarnate in physical bodies, and we're getting very esoteric now, but when they no longer need to do that, this is one of the places that they will graduate, because the devas are purely mental entities. They may occasionally step down to the astral level, but they are essentially mental entities, which is a much more rarefied kingdom than even the astral and certainly the physical. So it's down to, as I was saying earlier on, it's down to opening up your intuition in whatever way you can do that. Some people are able to do it by, listening to music or burning incense or going into a quiet place. And people tend to do it in very, very different ways. And it's really a question of what works for you. But to begin with, you have to accept the possibility that these things are there in the first place. One of the most interesting things I read about the nature spirits was through the works of a man called Geoffrey Hodgson, who was a member of the Theosophical Society in the early 20th century. And he was a highly developed clairvoyant. And about 100 years ago, he clairvoyantly looked at a woman during the 9 months of pregnancy, looking at the different stages and how these nature spirits were helping to build the physical body of the fetus in the woman's body, but also helping to build human beings' other bodies, the astral body and the mental body. And he observed the relationship that took place between these nature spirits and the higher directing forces of the angels, or devas, as they're called in the East. Deva is a word, by the way, that's a Sanskrit word, and it simply means shining ones. But devas and angels are the Christian way of looking at it. But every culture has some concept of these. And the two work very, very closely together. So you could regard the angels or the devas as the architects, and you can regard the nature spirits or elementals as the builders or the workers, but they are directed from this higher authority.
Well, that is brilliant. And you have really got me thinking. And I hope that everyone watching has also had their minds racing with ideas. So I want to thank you very much, Tim, for your time today.
Okay, well, thank you very much for asking me. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
And if people wanted to learn more about elementals and also your work and theosophy, how do they do that? How do they find you?
Well, they can find me. I've written a number of books on this, and they can be obtained through my website, which is firewheelbooks.co.uk.
I have made a note of that, and I will be putting a link to that in the description box. Thank you so much once again.
Okay, thank you very much.
And thank you all for watching. You can also check out my own website. I am going to be running a course on the houses. I believe it will probably be middle of July. And until next time, next time, I think we're going to be looking at current trends and transits. Until then, have a great week. Goodbye.